I think it's definitely almost the worst case scenario. This is one that shocked Australian diplomats, Young's family, his supporters. It's a devastating sentence, and really the only thing worse would be a more immediate execution. It means that effectively, unless he wins an appeal against China's courts, he will spend the rest of his life in jail.
And we need to talk a little about the process that's already played out, a trial behind closed doors. The chances of him winning an appeal would be very, very slim, I'd imagine.
Exceedingly slim. It's almost impossible in China to overturn a conviction, a country that has a 99% conviction rate in the first place. This is going to be a huge uphill battle now for Australian negotiators who, up until this point, have barely been allowed into the courtroom to hear the charges against Dr. Young. Many of his supporters still don't know what the actual allegations are that he faces in regards to espionage for an unnamed country. So this is a really challenging legal dynamic to work with. And now, having had this verdict handed down, it's difficult to see how they're going to be able to get a positive outcome down the track.
Yeah. How transparent will this 2-year probation period be before it potentially can be commuted to a life sentence? I mean, this is it literally is a life and death situation that we probably won't be able to observe.
Well, that's right. It's been completely opaque thus far. I don't think there's any optimism that it will become suddenly more transparent now. The legislation is vague. It's unclear if this would prevent, for example, his family and his supporters from continuing to speak out on his behalf, whether that could put him at more risk while he's in jail serving this suspended sentence. The sort of technical terms being that as long as he doesn't commit another crime while he is in jail, then he should have his sentence commuted to life in prison. But of course, what constitutes a crime under Chinese law is open widely to interpretation.
How common is a sentence like this in China?
Well, human rights experts believe that this is the most severe sentence against a foreign national for espionage since 1949. So that's quite the symbol of how seriously China is obviously taking this case. It's very rare for foreigners who hold citizenship of another country to have death sentences like this handed down against them, except for in drug crime cases. So that is the real challenge now that the Chinese system has put this case up on such a pedestal, how they then walk back from that without losing face. And of course, within the Chinese system, that is to be avoided at all costs. The challenge, again, is to try and negotiate a way through that perhaps gives him a better quality of life, access to visits, medical assistance, while dealing with some pretty horrific sets of circumstances.
You know, Eric, it's so curious at a time, I mean, it was just last week or the week before, where China was saying it wanted a stronger relationship with Australia. They wanted to sort of have almost full normalisation. How do we read this kind of decision-making today?
China, it can be exactly like that. It can, it sort of veers wildly occasionally from, this kind of detente, this sense of repairing the relationship, to all of a sudden having one of the most severe sentences handed down against an Australian that you could possibly imagine. There's another way to also look at this, which is that in China, the way that policy is delivered, the Ministry of State Security, for example, which takes care of justice and the courts, isn't necessarily that interested in the foreign relations of China. And so that this decision, perhaps taken in isolation, the Ministry of State Security is sending a message that it is cracking down hard on potential national security breaches, perhaps without too much regard for the foreign policy position it might well put Beijing in. So there's a lot of different factors at play here. Certainly, you wouldn't expect this kind of decision to be handed down without those at the very top at least being aware of it, in which case it is going to become for a very uncomfortable meeting when Premier Li Qiang is expected to visit Australia later this year.
Indeed. And of course, we know that the ambassador was summoned to Canberra today for them to express their displeasure. But to your point, this is going to be very difficult negotiations just to give him a more comfortable time in jail. The chances of him being allowed to serve his sentence in Australia, and we know that he's not well, is probably very unlikely too.
Yes, I think serving the sentence in Australia would be an unbelievable concession for the Chinese authorities to make. You know, they are making an example of Yang Hengjun, particularly because he did work for Chinese state security and with China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs before he came to Australia in 1998. He then became an academic and pro-democracy blogger, and he criticised the Chinese government loudly and publicly. He wrote over 10 million words of criticism of the Chinese government, a government that he used to work for while he was in Australia and then later in the United States. And I think they are making a very public declaration that this kind of dissent, particularly from someone who is a Chinese citizen originally and then naturalised to become Australian, and secondly, who worked for the Chinese government, is unacceptable.
Yeah, very well put. A cautionary trail. Eric, great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bev.